Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. It's Wednesday, July 31st, and I'm April Urban, Director of Research and Impact at Signal Cleveland, and moderator for today's conversation. It's the fourth forum in the City Club's free outdoor summer series, underneath the chandelier right here in Playhouse Square. And today we're digging into one of my favorite things, data. Data can reveal patterns and unlock a holistic understanding of our systemic challenges. And the data we are about to dig into this afternoon is part of Who Owns America, or WHOA, which is a unique and ambitious effort by the Center for Geospatial Solutions at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Its findings have been cited by the White House in an effort to address our nation's current housing affordability crisis, and is used to uncover ownership patterns with unprecedented accuracy, ease, and nuance. So how can municipalities, nonprofits, and grassroots organizations use WHOA to respond to challenges in their communities? And what is the impact of institutional investors in housing across America? Joining me on stage to discuss this and more is Laura Brenner, President and Chief Executive Officer at the Port of Greater Cincinnati Development Authority, and George Mac McCarthy, President and CEO of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. If you have a question for our speakers, you can text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. And the City Club staff will try to work it into the second half of the program. Members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Laura Brenner and Mac McCarthy. So we're starting off today with a question for Laura. Laura, the Cincinnati Port Authority is unique in Ohio, and it wears many hats: economic development, land bank, community development corporation, and you do housing assistance, all wrapped into one. Can you tell us a little bit about why the Cincinnati Port Authority takes on all these roles and how it became involved in the issue of affordable housing?
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. So Ohio is blessed with a great structure under the Ohio Revised Code of Economic Development Agencies. So one of them is the Port Authority legislation. There are 68, I think, port authorities in the state. We're one of 68. And then of the so that's one layer. We're a port authority. Ours is formed jointly by the City of Cincinnati and Hamilton County, and those two entities appoint board members. We're a quasi-governmental agency with very broad powers. The next thing we have in the Ohio Revised Code are land banks. That legislation is actually even broader than the Port Authority legislation. Of our 88 counties, 69 of them operate land banks. And in our case, we are the managers of the land bank. And then additionally, we manage an affordable housing nonprofit. And more recently, we have taken on the management of a CDC, a large CDC that is responsible for 5 neighborhoods surrounding our universities and hospitals in what we call Uptown. So we are a development finance agency, a community development entity, a land bank, port authority. We wear lots of different hats. Our general motivation is to take all the tools that we have and make the biggest difference possible. So we are very proactive, we are risk tolerant, and we're have a high sense of urgency to make the biggest difference possible. So directly to your affordable housing question, that goes back to our management of the land bank, which we took over 12 and a half years ago, right after it was incorporated, and really simultaneously with my tenure beginning at the Port Authority. And the land bank legislation allows us to take title to vacant, always vacant and blighted real estate for the purpose of putting it back into productive use. And if you think about it, where are the vacant blighted homes? They are in our poor neighborhoods that have been disinvested over the last 100 years. So that automatically puts you in the space of affordable housing. And we took the position not of just demolishing houses, but of saving every structure that was possible. So we do renovation and subsequent sale. And if the house was too far gone, we do demolition. And then we either build a new house on that lot, or we're selling it to somebody specifically for the construction of a house.
Okay. Thank you. For MAC, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy is an international expert working with nations and communities on all issues involving land, how to use land and resources equitably, environmental conservation, and land and taxes and development project financing. Tell us how you ended up diving into the data around investor ownership and what you found out about who owns America.
Sure. So just so you know, the Lincoln Institute was founded by a Cleveland inventor who also founded Lincoln Electric Company, which is still here in Euclid, Ohio. So we have deep roots in Cleveland, and we're always happy to be here. So the Lincoln Institute, we've been working for about almost 80 years trying to help local governments in particular, but also state and national governments find ways to manage land to get to other kind of better outcomes, whether it's helping to adapt to or mitigate the climate crisis, or whether it's to do things like protect land for endangered species. So when I came to Lincoln Institute about 10 years ago, one of my aspirations was to actually create a semi-annual report called The State of the Nation's Land. And we wanted to talk about what is actually going on in the land in the United States. So about 4 years ago, we founded a thing called the Center for Geospatial Solutions, and we brought some of the best data nerds in the country to come work with us and be able to really tell the story about what's going on land. And now we're prepared to do what I wanted to do 10 years ago. But before we started to get into telling the entire story about what's going on land, we kept getting questions coming from cities about anecdotal accounts of the disappearance of all the starter homes. And they're saying, where are all the starter homes going, and why is it that the starter homes are being bought up by investors and they're being converted from owner occupancy to rentals? And so, you know, we listen to anecdotal evidence, but we want to, you know, validate it. And so one of the first tasks I set for our people in the Center for Geospatial Solutions, and by the way, our innovations director there, Jeff Allenby, is in the crowd. And if you have any questions about data, about Northern Ohio, about Cleveland, he's here to answer them. So don't worry about that. So I asked them to actually start to look at some cities and tell me, can we detect what is going on with the single-family housing stock? And is it true that it's slipping into the hands of investors away from the hands of families? And unfortunately, it is true. And it's happening everywhere.
Yeah. Just like you just said, since the recent housing boom, everybody's feeling the crunch. Laura, can you tell us what you've seen in Cincinnati around investor ownership? Any trends that you can speak to?
Yes, it was 3 years ago, almost exactly, that we read an article in the Wall Street Journal about this issue of investor homes, and it featured Ohio as one of the places where that's happening most often because of high rents and low home values, and it specifically identified Cleveland as a place where this was happening with great frequency. So we think we know a lot about what's happening in Hamilton County, but we weren't aware of this trend, despite the fact that at any one time we own about 1,000 parcels throughout the county and are working in these very neighborhoods. We just didn't know this. So we did not have access to any fancy software. I just went to one of our young associates who actually is also a data nerd, no offense intended, and asked him to see if he could figure out what was happening in our county. And he probably spent 80 hours, because when you go to the auditor's website, actually the first thing we did is went to our city law department, City of Cincinnati Law Department, to the code enforcement attorneys and said, who are the 5 worst landlords that you're dealing with? They gave us the names of those that have the most code violations and problems with eviction. And then we said, all right, how many houses do those 5 own? And of course, that's a very, very difficult thing to figure out, because as we eventually found, there's one of those 5 landlords had 80 LLCs in our county. So what he had to do was match similar names and addresses, and it just took a very, very long time. But we ultimately found out that there are 4,200 homes 3 years ago owned by just 5 investor groups. And those are just the ones that we were able to find. So then we were just horrified, and we start mapping that. We presented it to our land bank board, and then we presented it to the municipal association and the township league. And really, we didn't have any answers. We just started to say, hair on fire, this is a problem. And then very strangely, within a couple months, I got a call from the manager of a local commercial real estate firm that had been asked to be a receiver for 2,000 homes in 3 different cities. And that one of those 5 bad landlords was the owner of this. And this is I think Stanford educated, Harvard MBA, investment banker, so a very sophisticated guy who had built up a portfolio of properties across the country, leveraged them up, and then basically walked away. So the lenders put it into foreclosure, and there was a receiver appointed. And the particular 2,000 he was asking me about were in 3 different cities in 2 different states. And I said, if you can peel off the ones that are here in Hamilton County, we're definitely interested. So he came back to me a couple months later and said, all right, the judge has approved that. We're going to take 200 houses here in Hamilton County to auction. Are you interested in bidding on them? And my immediate answer, as I said, I'm risk tolerant, was yes. And then we went back and said, oh my gosh, what does this mean? We've been dealing with vacant properties, and it's a big difference to have vacant properties versus tenants. But our board very much came on board. We reached out to our local legal aid and a number of other nonprofits to make sure we would have support, because this was going to be a difficult undertaking. And unanimously, we heard that you've got a moral obligation to do this. If you're able to do it, you should do it. And so we bid against 12 other institutional investors to win this portfolio. We issued bonds for $16.5 million. And we were only able to get into 30 of these 200 houses. And not in hindsight, surprisingly, when they told us we saw 10 of the worst, 10 of the average, and 10 of the best, we actually saw 30 of the best. And when they told us that only 10 were vacant, lo and behold, 65 were vacant. So our projections, both for the rental income we were going to get, as well as the amount of money we would need for investment to repair homes, were vastly off. But we're 2 years into this, 2 years and a few months into it, and we've started on the renovation of the vacant houses. We have 25 of those sold. We'll have another 25 sold this year. We have put all the tenants we've offered all of them home ownership training and financial assistance training, financial literacy, to get them ready for home ownership. And we're deeply committed to this idea.
And then Mac, similarly, what can you tell us about differences in communities among trends with investor owners? Do they operate differently in different types of communities that you've seen in the data? And any data that you have about Cleveland and Cuyahoga County? I'm sure everybody's all ears.
So when we get to the questions and answers, I'm actually going to ask Jeff to tell us what is actually going on in Cuyahoga County. So you'll get the actual data from our savant. He's not just a nerd, he's a savant as well. Right? So here's the thing, right? So this is a big problem. Right now in the United States, there's 80 million single-family homes, and 16 million of them are owned by investors. So that's 20% of the single-family housing stock in the United States today is owned by investors. But in 2023, almost 30% of all single-family transactions went from owner-occupants to investors. So it's getting worse. And then just to make it even worse, just this morning, Bloomberg just reported that there's an unprecedented $1.2 trillion worth of what they call dry powder in the private equity market looking for a place to invest. And a lot of the investors that are going to buy up these single-family homes are private equity investors working through REITs and other private equity funds to go and buy these things. So think about it this way. every home in the United States is either a place that provides shelter for people and families, or provides an investment opportunity for global investors. But when in the competition between global investment and families seeking shelter, who do you think is going to win? And as it turns out, families are losing. And the stock that is actually slipping out of our control is the very stock that people would consider to be the stock that we bought by first-time home buyers. So when you ask about, what are we seeing in different places across the nation? Number one, we're seeing a huge concentration of purchases in low-income neighborhoods, like Laura mentioned, in minority neighborhoods, and instead of like 20% of the national housing stock being bought up by investors, in some of those neighborhoods, north of 80% of the housing stock is now owned by investors that are then renting them out. So it's a problem.
And if I can add one thing that is interesting is there's another victim in this, and that is the homeowner who sold their house. Because the buyers are often, you're aware of this, the postcards, the knock on the door, the flyers, cash offers, $50,000 next week. And so these homeowners are getting ripped off on their disposition of their house. And we've got one example in Cincinnati where there are two houses immediately across the street from each other. One homeowner sold for $135,000 to a new family that has an $800 mortgage payment and a chance to build wealth. Across the street, old homeowner sold for $50,000 to an investor who's now charging $1,300 a month for rent. So two neighbors across the street, one's paying $800 in a mortgage, the other one's paying $1,300 in rent. And then what's worse, another layer of it is that the investors, one of the first things they do is take out all of the landscaping because they don't want to manage that. When I talked to the CEO of one of these entities, he admitted that they do more subtraction than addition to the landscaping. And so that combined with their inattention to the building and the house and the quality of the repairs, attention to repairs and improvements, it's bringing down the surrounding homeowners' values as well. So there are a lot of victims in this.
Well, just to add to what Laura was saying, so you mentioned that there were like 88 kind of LLCs that were actually flowing up to one investment opportunity, and so one investment group. And one of the things that Jeff and his team did was they actually went through open corporate data and SEC filings to kind of backtrack from the investors to figure out where is the actual source of the money. And so when you think about it, you see these things like We Buy Ugly Houses, right, all over the place. You think some mom and pop landlords are going to go out and buy one house and rent it out. Private equity is the source of capital that sits behind We Buy Ugly Houses. And they're just, most of the people going around scaring people into selling their houses for less than they're worth, have a whole script where they scare people into thinking about what is going to happen to their house when the roof goes, when the furnace goes, and how they're not going to be able to afford to keep it when the property taxes go up, right? And so then they convince people to sell them on cash deals for much less than they're worth, and they transfer the ownership to the private equity investors that are invisible until Jeff and his team are able to kind of sleuth it out going through the open corporate data to figure it out. And so now Jeff actually has a map to show which investors are investing where. And there are some investors that are just pure bottom feeders. They're going to the poorest and the highest minority density neighborhoods, and they're buying up all the houses. And then there's others that are actually targeting kind of the suburban markets, buying kind of middle-class suburban homes and doing that. And the first investor, the first big investor in that space, called Invitation Homes, was set up by Blackstone after the great financial crisis, when they were buying up tens of thousands of non-performing mortgages with the expectation they're going to flip the homes. But they realized after a while, when they couldn't flip the homes as quickly as they wanted to, the cash flow that they're able to generate from owning these homes and renting them out was so substantial that they decided to set up their own property management company called Invitation Homes, which now owns about 100,000 homes across the country, right? So it's insidious, and it's driven by economics that we can understand, that we can also interrupt if we decide we want to interrupt it, right?
So we've heard a lot about the problem. We want to be a little bit more optimistic. Let's get a little bit of good news in here. How have you worked with investor owners, or how have you seen other cities working with investor owners to try to make them a productive part of providing safe quality housing? What can you prescribe for Cleveland when it comes to investor owners?
I have a couple ideas. One is our city law department has become very aggressive. They have filed 2 lawsuits against the largest landlord that we have in our area, the ones with the most code violations and eviction issues, and have forced them to the table, unfortunately not to get them out, but to hold them accountable to be at least better landlords. Another weapon that we have is media attention. As I said, 3 years ago when I read this article, it wasn't being talked about, and now it's on 60 Minutes. NBC came to Cincinnati. I was on an NBC show talking about this. I've been on national NPR talking about this, and that has brought one of the largest investor to meet with me in my office because they're tired of the bad press. And we issued some, if you really want to be a good partner, these are the things we would ask you to do. They made the claim that investor owners are only 2% of the homeowners in the country, something like that. I said, well, on some of our city streets, you own 50% of the houses, and we want you to disinvest and sell back to either homeowners or to us in the meantime. Another layer is I'm talking to a class action plaintiff's attorney, arming him with information, including the addresses of the 4,000 tenants that there are in Cincinnati with these 5 landlords, and encouraging him to consider a class action lawsuit. I told him this is your Lincoln lawyer chance, you can do something really good here. And then we're advocating in different ways. We're working with Sherrod Brown's office. We're working with the National Housing, I can't remember the name of the association, with their lobbying group, because I think that one of the things that could really make a difference here is to change the national tax law. If we prohibited the deduction of depreciation on single-family houses, that would make a phenomenal difference. So there are some things to do, but it's probably none of them are fast.
Yeah, so we have about a dozen policy remedies that cities can take on to try to manage this thing. But I have to say, number one, all right, so these investor owners aren't monolithic. There's some aren't horrible, and they're not going to be punishing the neighborhoods or punishing their residents. But the problem is you don't know who's who and how it's working. And so the first thing that we advise cities to do is actually to create a rental registry. A rental registry is not hard to create. You just want to know who's renting out their homes, what they're charging, and what the addresses are. But if you start a rental registry, then you should also take a little bit of time to look and make sure that these rental units are safe and sound and they're not putting the residents at risk. And if you have those kinds of inspections and you're tracking rents, then you can also do things like consider things like rent stabilization, where you can actually limit the amount that rents could go up every year. But you can only limit the amount that rents go up every year if you know what they're renting for in the first place. Even more insidious is the short-term rental market, which we know a lot less about than we should. But in the last estimate that I was looking at, there's about somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million short-term rental units in the United States. These are Airbnb, Vrbo, a lot of us use them sometimes, right? But what we don't have is a registry of those unless the local government takes them on. And we've talked to lots of local governments who actually have those short-term rental registries. And they use that to do a lot of things, like number one, inspect the homes to make sure that they're safe and sound. But number two, to actually tax people who are doing short-term rentals like their hotels. There's a lot more revenue you should be getting from a short-term rental than you actually are because they're invisible. And so we've been looking at ways to kind of continue to add to our databases and identify the short-term rental markets. But code enforcement is a big deal. And a lot of places don't put as much effort into code enforcement as they should. And they will if they're going to be using it as a method for being able to manage what's going on in the rental markets. And then, public participation. The economics that drive investors that go into these housing markets, buy up these homes for profitable purposes, those economics work for the public sector, they work for the civic sector. There's no reason why we can't actually get our CDCs and our ports, our redevelopment agencies to actually buy and control properties and make the revenue from them. And then on the taxation side, so homestead exemptions, right? One of the things that we've been advocating for in general is that we give homestead exemptions for owner occupants so that the first, whatever, $50,000 or $100,000 of value is not subject to the property tax. So then if you're not an owner occupant, you have to pay property tax on the full value of the property. Before we came over here, Laura was telling me that they actually did a study of the homes that they bought in Cincinnati. And what was it, 85 of them were getting the homestead exemption, even though they're getting rented out, right? So we have to make sure we enforce our own rules. But then, the idea that a homeowner is limited on the mortgage interest tax deduction and on the property tax deduction to $10,000 on their income tax, but a landlord can take the full amount of those deductions from the top line, not just amortization. So we have to reform those tax laws, but that's at a national level. And then, if we actually have things like inclusionary zoning, if you have people who own more than 7 homes, you can ask them to make one of those an inclusionary unit if you have an inclusionary law. So in Boston, 1 out of 7 units has to be inclusionary, meaning it's offered at below market rates. So if a landlord owns 14 units, now they have to make 2 of them affordable, right? And they don't like that. But if you enforce it, these start to change the economics, and it works better for everybody because it also generates more revenue for the local government.
We've been focused on talking about investor-owned homes, but both of your organizations do so much more than just look at investors. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us about any other promising programs and strategies you've seen to build quality, equitable, affordable housing and communities.
Over the last, it's probably been 11 years now, we have either renovated or built and sold 250 homes in Cincinnati and Hamilton County, all below 300,000 and probably 60% of them below 250,000. So we're very much focused on putting vacant lots and vacant homes back into productive use, filling in the missing teeth inside of our neighborhoods. We're using lots of different sources for the subsidy that's required because we're losing money on every single one of those. We've got private sector investment, we've got ARPA funds, we've got foundation grants. So we're really cobbling together a lot of different sources to be able to make that happen. We also run a down payment assistance program across the state. So we've got that to add to the mixture as well.
So April, you mentioned that the White House cited us last week, and so one of the things that the Center for Geospatial Solutions is doing is looking at what the opportunities are in different places to build new homes. Because one of the reasons why housing has become so unaffordable is because we've built a lot less housing in the last 10 or 15 years than we should have, especially since the great financial crisis. And so there's, depending on who you talk with, there's a shortage of between, say, 2 and 7 million units of housing in the United States, right? So in the last couple of months, we were approached by different states to ask if we gave churches the right to build multifamily housing on their own land, how much housing can we build? And so the state of Arizona was considering passing what it's called Yes in God's Backyard, right? It's a legislation that will allow churches as of right to build multifamily housing on their own land. And so we estimated for the state of Arizona how many acres of church-owned land there was and what is the housing potential of that land. And then Massachusetts was thinking about doing the YIGB, Yes in God's Backyard regulation as well. They came to us and asked us to map out church-owned land in Massachusetts. So just for grins and giggles, we decided, well, let's just take a look at all the church-owned lands in the United States. And so Jeff came back to me with a number. He said that there's about 725,000 parcels of land owned by churches in the United States. Now, not all of those are in places you want to build housing, but there's a lot of housing you can build on these 722,000 parcels, which I think was maybe about 2 million acres or something when we got through adding it all up. Wow. So then the White House came to us and said, well, can you tell us where the publicly owned land is? The land that's owned by local governments, is owned by county governments, state governments, and federal governments. And can you tell us where the most desirable publicly owned land is, so that if we decided to create incentives for local governments and state governments to build on that land, how much housing can we get there? So Jeff and he dragooned his folks into this work for about 2 weeks. We sifted through 200 million parcels of land in the United States to find every parcel is owned by any level of government. And then we sifted it down to only those that are mostly vacant, that aren't in parks and aren't in watersheds, aren't in land that you wouldn't want to develop on, and are accessible to public transit. And we found out there is more than 250,000 acres of publicly owned land in U.S. cities available for development right now. And we estimated that depending on how densely you developed it, you could develop between 1.9 and 6.9 million units of housing on that land, which is pretty close to our estimated shortage of housing alone, just from the publicly owned land. And could you imagine if the public sector decided that they're going to work together with the civic sector, and instead of selling off that land, lease it off and create large community land trusts that could then maintain affordable housing in perpetuity for their local families. I mean, there's many strategies you can use, but as it turns out, first we need to find what we can do, and then we have to figure out how we're going to get it done. And so we're now on that second step, and then once we get the political will going, we then go ahead and start building, and I think that will happen soon.
Thanks so much. Yeah. We are about to begin the audience Q&A. For our live stream audience at cityclub.org or those just joining us, I'm April Urban, Director of Research and Impact at Signal Cleveland, and moderator for today's conversation. We are digging into data and housing affordability this afternoon. On stage with me is Laura Brenner, President and Chief Executive Officer at the Port of Greater Cincinnati Development Authority, and George Mac McCarthy, President and CEO of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, as well as our live stream audience. If you'd like to text a question for our speakers, please text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794, and City Club staff will try to work it into the program. May we have the first question, please?
Good afternoon. The first question is, currently you do have a rich data to help on housing, especially affordable. But the problem here is affordable to whom, correct? So I would like to know if any of your data can be incorporated into some kind of a mechanism, maybe legislation or city ordinance, to fight against zoning code. Thank you.
So could we just, wait a minute, don't go away. So fight against zoning code in what way? Are you thinking about exclusionary zoning? Or are you thinking
Correct.
About, okay.
Because based on your example, even there are lands available, even the soil or the physical environment is not contaminated, which will be suitable for housing. But the problem here is, even in our greater Cleveland area, city of Cleveland as well, we have a zoning code to still prevent having high quality but low cost housing to get built, to fight against our old housing stock full of lead and mold.
Okay, I can now understand. So one of the biggest issues, and really the root of NIMBYism, is people do not want to see dense developments in their neighborhoods. They don't like multifamily housing in single family areas. And so one of the things that we've been seeing now, it's a trend that's going on around the country, is state governments are now stepping in to preempt local exclusionary practices. So there's 12 different state governments now who have created preemptive legislation that says that they're going to allow certain kinds of developments in communities in spite of the efforts of the communities to exclude it. So for example, in Massachusetts, where I'm from, they have the thing called the MBTA Communities Act, and they're now requiring any community that is served by the public transit system to dedicate land to be developed for multifamily housing that will be affordable and accessible to transit. Now, the local governments do not like that, and so they're running around trying to find ways to prevent it. But even in places like Nebraska and Utah and other places, they're finding all sorts of ways to introduce what they call soft density. So they're saying, we are no longer going to allow people just to require single-family detached dwellings on single parcels, but you're going to be able to build 2 to 4 units on a single-family parcel. So in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, they've banned single-family zoning altogether, right? In other places, they're saying, as of right, you can build an accessory dwelling unit if you can add it to your site, and that's soft density as well. And so little by little, I think as a country, we're starting to confront the challenges of what we call home rule local control, and finding ways to, take away the ability of really narrow local communities to exclude others using just the rules, like the zoning rules.
Hi, thank you for being here. I always appreciate when you bring up preemption. I know we have a midterm plan here in the state of Ohio to help regain local control of our local communities by banning gerrymandering in the fall. My question is about governance in the conversation of ownership. I know that a lot of the reforms that you mentioned to mitigate some of the risks that housing investment has disproportionate impact on Black communities, especially in Cleveland, where 1 of 2 people rent. But I don't know much about your organization, so I can look. But I think for the topic of conversation on real equity in housing, where do your policy recommendations lie on the topic of governance and democratic ownership of housing as a way to talk about real, permanent, affordable housing in terms of investment and governance and how decisions are made for housing ownership?
Well, sure. So, I mentioned the fact that one of the unfortunate truths about our housing stock in the United States is that it's trying to meet the needs of 2 different markets, right? The investment market and the market for shelter. And I'm an economist, and I'll just get wonky for a second. There's no market, there's no single price that can clear 2 markets simultaneously, right? And so what happens is once your housing stock gets attractive to outside investors, there's nothing you can do to prevent it from kind of escalating the prices. So for us, one of the remedies is to actually take a share of your housing stock and remove it from the speculative market. The best way to do that is through something like a community land trust, which is community owned, community managed. And so we've been helping to get community land trusts going, get them scaled up. And there's about 300 community land trusts in the United States now, but they're small, right? And so what we need to find is ways to move public funds into the community land trust space to scale them up so that we get more and more of that housing that's maintained as permanently affordable in perpetuity. Because the community land trusts they're a perpetual organization. You remove the land from the speculative market and you keep the housing affordable, and outside speculators can't come in and buy it out from under you. So that's one of the best,
What we talk about a lot is the balance between wealth creation in these Black and brown neighborhoods and permanent affordability. And there's a conflict there too. The houses that we've sold we've always, we're subsidizing houses, right? So it's an incentive to the homeowner to buy it. And we have required a 5-year residency, but we have not capped their sale price when they sell. We recently did a study and went back and looked at the first 120 houses that we sold and found that we've been doing this long enough that we now have 29 subsequent sales that have happened, and saw that those homeowners, the people who bought houses from us, had a 52% profit when they sold the house. So then we're like, oh no, we've overly enriched a few people. And so now we're moving to a model where we're exploring the model that's not exactly community land trust, but it does require some piece of that subsidy to come back to us when they sell, so that we can recycle that and help more people and not just have that homeowner capture the whole profit.
Sure. So that's called deed restriction, and deed restricted housing as a governance question. So long as you have somebody that's able to manage your deed restricted housing stock, that's another way that you can use a legal instrument to keep your housing affordable in perpetuity. And right now, I'd say in the United States, there's probably almost 10 times as much deed restricted housing as there is housing in community land trusts. So it's a powerful tool. Right?
Yeah, so we've used deed restrictions for various aspects. A, residency. B, you have to pay your property taxes. C, you have to take care of the house. But we have lacked until recently the mechanism for the tracking, but now we've got software to be able to manage that as well. So it's complicated.
Looks like we have another question.
This is a text question. How can community development organizations compete with the private equity firms to get possession of our homes back into the hands of owner occupants?
I think the CDC should start by talking to the city, honestly. I think that, because ultimately, I think the CDCs can participate in this, but they generally lack the resources. So that gets to having some kind of a fund, and whether you have to look within your within your city at what organizations can be at the table. And I'd start with the city that can help you determine that. And that's the answer to that is part of the reasons of why we have continued to morph and taken on different roles so we can be a one-stop shop for as much as possible.
So let's just talk about the economics. Why is it that investors are buying up these homes to rent them out? And so for every $500 of net monthly income you get out of a rental, if you capitalize that the way you do in the rental market, that will capitalize into a $100,000 valuation, right? So let's say, for example, let's say you have a 3-family house that you're going to rent for $2,000 a month, and it costs you, let's say, it wouldn't cost you this much. Let's say it costs you $500 a month in expenses to manage that property. That home would be worth $300,000 on the market because you'd have a net of $1,500 a month worth of revenue, right? So those economics that work for investors work the same way for CDCs. So if they were buying up housing and they were able to buy it at the going rate, rent it at the going rate, they could actually make a healthy return on that housing. Now, one of the problems that most CDCs have is that they're bleeding hearts, right? And so they want to do both things. They want to buy it, and then they want to rent it below market rate, and they'll beggar themselves to be able to serve the community. And we need to find a way to either help bring them the right kind of subsidy to do it, or we have to get them to be a little bit more, business-like to kind of really build out their housing stock to really make a difference in their neighborhoods.
So they even if the economics work and they're willing to pay that price and rent it out at that amount, they still generally aren't bankable. The CDC can't borrow the money to even do that. Right. So that's where you've got to find some resource as a community to be able to put that together. And then the other very sad thing, the biggest thing we've realized since we bought these houses is what bad shape they're in. And investors buying those houses don't care because they're just going to continue to rent them at high prices in bad shape. The civic partner, we are not going to sell a house that's not put together. We're putting in, none of them had air conditioning. We're putting in, upgrading the electric, putting in the air conditioning, putting in some cases, solar panels. We're trying to make them energy efficient. And that all costs money. So then that's more subsidy. That the economics then are different for the civic group than the private sector because we're trying to do it better.
This is a text question. What percentage of single-family homes are owned by investors in Ohio, and where does Ohio rank nationally?
So I'm going to ask Jeff to answer that. So Jeff's over here. So I don't know if you have all of Ohio, but you certainly have Northern Ohio and you have Cuyahoga County, right?
Thanks. So processed and looked at the numbers for Northern Ohio, Northeastern Ohio. Right now it's about 55% owner occupied and about 45% investor owned for all properties across Northeast Ohio. However, if you look at the numbers year by year, especially on recent sales, the percentage of investor owned properties of recent sales is creeping up year over year and is now over 50% of recent sales are investor owned.
Are you looking is that at all sale prices or just like houses valued less than 300?
All sale prices.
At all prices, it's 45%, which means that if you take the houses at less than 300,000, it is dramatically higher than that because that's where they're targeting.
I didn't know. I didn't ask Jeff before we came up with what the statistics were because if you told me that, that's chilling to think about. If more than half of the transactions are shifting your housing stock from owner occupancy to rental. And I don't know about you folks in the audience, but the country I grew up in was a country of homeowners. Yeah. And home ownership was actually kind of one of the methods for creating family wealth, for intergenerational transfers of wealth. It was also kind of a status symbol of success for family. But we're kind of, if we keep selling off that housing stock and we're going to be rented out, we're going to become a nation of renters, and that's a very different nation than we have right now.
We're gonna make the racial wealth gap worse than it is.
Yeah. How do we close the racial wealth gap without closing the racial home ownership gap? And how do you close the racial home ownership gap if you have no homes to sell, right? Yeah.
Looks like we have another question.
My question is, I'm a resident of the city of East Cleveland, and I've been there just about all my life. I'm a homeowner. I own the house across the street from where I grew up. What I'm wondering is, how do we hold these investment companies responsible? What do we do? I have a house across the street and next door to me, which unfortunately my longtime neighbor sold, and it's owned by the same investment company. I worry about, there's renters in the house next door now. A lot of times it's Section 8 because it's East Cleveland and we're a very depressed community. So you're not going to get wealthy people wanting to move into these houses, not yet anyway, not until we come back if we can. So what do we do in order to hold them accountable for these homes? If something goes wrong, you have a bad renter, the house is bought and left, just vacant.
So that goes back to this conversation about code enforcement. So call the city when the grass is too high, call the city if there's a car parked in the front yard, or, there are a number of different infractions that are they're meant to be, to hold homeowners accountable for preserving not only their own home, but the values of the homes around them. And so I would, really be vigilant with the city to get more active in enforcing code.
Well, having worked for the city of East Cleveland before, now with the county, we again are a very depressed community. Inspectors are very, very few. I'm not even gonna go into the problems of East Cleveland, okay? But if that doesn't work, is there another level we can go to put a fire there to get stuff done? Because that's what I worry about. Our community is kind of overlooked,
So one question is, do you have good relations with your neighbors, the renters that are renting those houses that are there?
I don't know them.
Oh, well, get to know them, because see, one of the things that, if they're Section 8, there's a requirement by HUD to inspect Section 8 homes every year, and if they're not up to code, then the landlord is going to get into trouble. Normally, the residents would be a little bit loath to kind of go to HUD and complain about, safety and soundness, but if they're not really being treated well, then they should actually let that be known, and that gets it to another level. And then separately, I think this idea of class action is an untapped potential for really taking on these large-scale landlords. And there's two methods of doing it. One is to actually, mobilize the tenants to go after their own landlords, but the other is to mobilize nearby homeowners who can then accuse the owners of introducing neighborhood blight and nuisance, right? Now, once again, you're going to have to find a lawyer who wants to build a class. You're going to have to go and figure it out. But if it becomes a big enough problem, you can then take it to your state attorney general. You can take it to the courts and find a way to kind of, punish those folks, right? Yeah.
I will say I have received a call from the state attorney general's office. And maybe I probably shouldn't say what they are considering an action. I don't know if I'm supposed to say any more than that.
This is a text question. In some states like Ohio, they are rolling out programs to help individuals install solar panels on their home. But one of the requirements is that they must own their home. Considering that these investor groups are buying up family homes and subtracting infrastructure, do you think they pose a substantial threat to sustainable energy?
Absolutely.
They're not going to help anything.
Yeah, this is, so this has been a problem from forever, right? Because even in multifamily rental situations, there's almost no incentive for a landlord to actually improve the energy efficiency of the homes, because they're not the ones that benefit from the energy efficiency improvements. So we've seen this now ever since we've actually been trying to find ways to do better buildings in the United States, that we have to find a way to incentivize the landlords to do it. And right now, the landlords are not going to do it voluntarily. So without the right kind of either carrot or stick, it won't happen at all. And so if we have these ideas that we're going to create some kind of zero carbon community by making our buildings more energy efficient, we're not going to do it unless we find a way to get the landlords involved. And there's no reason for them to get involved at this point.
Selfishly, I have a question for you both, a little bit outside of affordable housing, but I wanted to ask Laura especially, the powers of the port are really broad. How do you help the general public understand and support your work? And I know we've talked a little bit about the context in Cuyahoga County. Homeowners and, well, everyone is seeing reappraisal values go up. They're thinking about their property taxes, and they're making assessments about what they like to support. So
I do not give us a very high grade on that. It's very difficult, and especially harder now with the media not being, I used to have the Cincinnati Enquirer at every one of my board meetings. Now they don't come. I have just the Business Courier coming to my board meetings. We do, we have a very, I think, a robust website, and we have a very, very active social media. But most people aren't looking for, they're not looking for, what's the Cincinnati Port doing? So the stakeholders that are interested in us, and that's not a small group, but it's like maybe there are 3,000 people that care, and they're well informed because they're reaching out to us. We're kind of meeting them in the middle with enough data to let them know. But it's a very difficult thing to get to the broader public. And we've done polling. So I've got data in the past that tells me this. The Cleveland Port Authority and the Toledo Port Authority are the only two cities, port authorities in the state that have a levy that's been passed to support them. And we did polling a few years ago to see if that would pass for us in Cincinnati. And the polling said people cared about all the different things we do, because in addition to everything we talked about today on the housing side, we're also working to reclaim industrial zone land and bring back manufacturing and create these great jobs. So people care about all the things we're doing, but the scores we got on whether anybody knew that we were doing it or even that we existed were pretty low. So it's
sounds like
very difficult.
A void in your local media system.
So, April, what's funny is that the word on the Port of Cincinnati is getting out much more broadly nationally than it is getting out within the area around Cincinnati. And, folks like us, we were writing about the port because they're one of the most innovative public entities or public-private entities that we know in the whole country, being able to be heroic and leverage their balance sheet to do great things for their community. So it just, it's funny how, local knowledge is very different from the national knowledge. And you can ask Laura, she gets pulled into meetings all over the country to talk about what they're doing in Cincinnati. But nobody in Cincinnati
one
knows
of
about
our
it.
county commissioners texted me a couple weeks ago. She was in Tampa at the ICMA, was it? National Association of Counties meeting. She texted me to say, somebody just stood up and gave a shout out to the Cincinnati Port Authority. I'm like, but random people in Cincinnati down the street, even downtown outside my office, you could say, who's the Cincinnati Port? And they wouldn't know.
We have time for one more audience question.
This is a text question. How bad is this in the inner ring suburbs? East Cleveland, Garvin Heights, Maple Heights, etc.
So where we've been looking at it in inner ring suburbs are just kind of the next destination for this kind of investment. But I think Jeff he actually has the map that will go down to kind of the parcel level in different neighborhoods to show you what's going on specifically in Cleveland. I don't know the Cleveland story.
In Cincinnati, it is our inner city neighborhoods, the red line neighborhoods that are worst. And then the map shows the migration of the African Americans that got displaced and moved. It really follows the path north along I-75 where our African Americans have moved over time. It's that sad.
Okay. Thank you to Laura Brenner and Mac McCarthy for joining us at the City Club today. The City Club's Outdoor Summer Series is sponsored by Thompson Hine with additional support from Cliffs, Today's forum is also presented in partnership with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Next Wednesday, August 7th, the City Club will be back under the chandelier. We'll hear from Jeremy Umansky, James Beard Award-nominated chef and author on the benefits of sustainable food sourcing. Idea Stream's Amy Eddings will moderate. Then for the final Outdoor Series Forum on Wednesday, August 14th, we will learn more about universal basic employment, what it is and is not, and what we can expect from Cleveland's pilot program. Councilwoman House, Devin Cotton, and Ken Surratt with the United Way will join that conversation. You can learn about each of these forums and what's next at the City Club at cityclub.org. Thank you once again to our speakers, and thank you members and friends of the City Club. I'm April Urban, and this forum is now adjourned.